Perfect. We have our three speakers in. So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're listening in from. Welcome to another Redline Twitter Space. This one focusing on the next 3 months in Ukraine. So, it's a absolutely big subject this today. There's been a lot of talk of a spring offensive coming up, and the situation is very interesting coming up, to say the least. And we have a fantastic panel of speakers today to be talking us through the next 3 months and what to expect. And joining us on the panel this evening is Daniel Speckhard, who's the president and CEO of Correspondent International, who's a humanitarian group who does some great work in the area. He's also the former ambassador to Belarus and Greece. We've also got Orysia Lutsevych, who's the head of Chatham House's Ukraine Forum, as well as Tom Mutch, who is a good friend of the show and a frontline journalist currently in Kiev, working for the Daily Beast, the Times, the New Lines, and everyone else. He's been covering the war since pretty much the start. In fact, he was in Kiev when the war began. So, Tom, you're in Kiev at the moment. I'll start with you. What is the vibe there at the moment? How is it different, and how has this war progressed since you've been there since day one?
Okay, so the war has gone through a lot of ups and downs since I first started, because of course, way back on February 24th last year, which God feels almost like 5 years ago now, we still had everything about how people were worried that the war could be over within a week, that the Russian army was just going to roll over everybody. Since then, there's obviously been there was a huge Ukrainian victory in Kiev, then there were the slow Russian advances in the Donbass until Western weapons sort of managed to turn the tide of the war. Then probably between about August to November last year, there was a sort of a surge of Ukrainian euphoria and enthusiasm, first after the Kharkiv counteroffensive and the significant recapturing of territory there, and finally ending with the recapture and the liberation of Kherson. However, since then, the war has sort of stalemated somewhat into a fairly grinding war of attrition, where the vast majority of the fighting is over two reasonably, by Ukrainian standards, small cities. Bakhmut, where the Russian forces have been making slow but grinding advances, and also Crimea and Svatove, the axis in the north, in Luhansk, where the Ukrainians have basically been trying to continue the momentum from the offensive where they took back Izium, Kupiansk, and Liman, but they seem to have ground to something of a halt there. So people are still hopeful, but I think I would say a lot of people in Ukraine thought that they might be a bit further forward than they have moved over the last couple of months. Also, of course, there was the loss of Soledar, which was the first Russian victory in nearly 6 months. However, and while that was a very well-defended town that a lot of fighting went into, it was only a small town of 10,000 people. And in the grand strategic picture, that really isn't that much.
Danny, you've been doing humanitarian work in the country for quite a while now. How have the humanitarian situation changed over the last year? What are the challenges you were facing early on in the war, and what are the humanitarian challenges now? I think you might be on mute, Daniel.
Thanks, Tom. Early in the war, we were dealing with lots of refugees as they moved away from the east, many of those flowing into Poland and other countries with really nothing in terms of their ability to continue and survive in their new environments. And so they needed a lot of support and help. What we're seeing now, obviously, is inside the country, about 7 million people are displaced, and the continued attacks on infrastructure are creating really a humanitarian and human rights catastrophe in the country.
And Orysia, you've been following the policy on this one for quite a while now. What met your expectations? What didn't meet your expectations? What in this war is going the way you thought it would?
Well, thanks, Michael, and great to be having this conversation. I think, first of all, it's important to understand that Ukraine is standing, and not only it's standing, it actually has upset all Putin's military objectives so far. I mean, obviously, people in Ukraine and in the West are tired of this because we are so much, facing the atrocity and violence that we have not seen on the European continent since the Second World War. But the fact that it lasts is actually good news, because it means that Putin failed to subjugate one of the largest European countries for his, imperial fantasy. And Ukrainians are not only obstructing Putin's plans, but they are blowing one of the most decisive defeats to the Russian armed forces since, in modern history. Because if you look at the number of casualties that Russians are taking in Ukrainian steppes in the south and east of Ukraine, it's more than what Soviet army lost in Afghanistan in 10 years. So what we are seeing is that incredible resolve, capacity to resist, but also obviously we see that Putin is not giving up despite all those losses on his objectives for this war. This means that we're going to see a new spiral of the battlefield, and we'll see how that evolves.
So, Tom, the talk of the town at the moment is about a spring offensive coming up. Obviously, during the winter, we've seen mostly fighting, as you said, limited to a few key cities. Do you think there is a large offensive coming up, and are people in Ukraine worried about something being launched probably around mid-February?
So there could be offensives really from either side. We know that both sides have been going through waves of mobilization to try and ready as many troops as possible. We also know that this is the time when new Western weapons, especially more advanced artillery systems and main battle tanks, are going to be coming through within the next couple of months. Now, basically, if you could look all over the map of Ukraine for potential targets, and Ukrainians are preparing for the potential of assaults from anywhere from Lviv in the west to Kiev in the center to Kharkiv in the east, or to even just another major push in the Donbass. Now, I personally think that the Russians are unlikely to try and go for Kiev again, simply because they messed up so badly the first time when the city wasn't particularly well defended. It's now probably one of the most well-defended cities in the world and one of the most well-prepared for an onslaught, with a population that they know will resist to the hilt. On my mind, it doesn't make very much sense to attack from there. There's been other talks about potentially the Belarusian army getting involved. I don't think that that will happen, simply because the war is very unpopular in Belarus. The Belarusian armed forces and police forces, which would potentially be fighting that war, are the only thing keeping President Lukashenko in power there, and they don't particularly want to go and get slaughtered in Ukraine, which is, I think, the main reason that Belarus has stayed out of the war. Now, in the east, Russia could recommit large numbers of the hundreds of thousands of men that we know that they do have training and are being mobilized. But there are, of course, serious questions not only about the readiness of those soldiers, but about the potential of Russian logistics to be able to supply them, and also whether the Russians have enough weaponry, food, that's ammunition, that sort of stuff to go along with a large offensive. Now, the Ukrainians would also like to keep going. There are two places that they could go for. They might make another push, as I mentioned earlier, on Crimea and try and cut Russian logistics into Luhansk, and then potentially be able to encircle Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, which they lost in June. Or the ultimate prize for them would be able to go down and try and cut the Crimean corridor around Tokmak and Melitopol, which could effectively mean that if you manage to cut the Crimean corridor, you've cut the Russians' land bridge to Crimea. The Kerch bridge is now well within artillery and HIMARS range, and you could effectively besiege Crimea and potentially win a major victory there. But all this is speculation, and outside of the top military command of both countries, no one really knows what's going to happen.
Daniel, in some of the earlier stages of the war, when we're doing pieces like this, there's been problems with, people can get food into Ukraine, but they can't get it the last 10 miles to effectively the front line because truck drivers don't want to go out there, or there are supply problems, or, there's no rail gauge out there. How are the supply lines in Ukraine working at the moment? And are you having success or difficulty getting those supplies to where they need to go?
Well, the biggest challenge, we are having difficulty, not just us, but everyone, in getting it right to the very places where it's most difficult. And that's not so much because if a town has been liberated, people are moving in right away and taking high risk to do so. And we can get trucks to go into those areas. The challenge is in areas where they're still fighting, and there's still significant civilian populations in many of these areas as the fighting shifts around. And those are the ones that you worry the most about, where people are basically surviving. Heard lots of stories when I was there in October about people surviving in their basements, for 3 months as the war rages around them, and coming out and then seeing that, all the houses around them are destroyed. Just recently, just yesterday, you saw an apartment building, four-story apartment building, get blasted by artillery fire. When that happens, and then it collapses, and then the people are in the basement, getting to them, getting them out, and then taking care of them while the war is still going on, that's the big challenge.
So, Orysia, the big news coming out of the last couple of days is to do with the tanks that have been committed to Ukraine now. There's also stories coming out this morning of drones and Reaper drones being committed to Ukraine, and there's talk of F-16s being committed to Ukraine as well. How much of an impact do you think this is going to have on the battlefield, and with the tanks in particular, how quickly do you think this will make a change on the battlefield?
Michael, Ukraine relies a lot on Western military supply to repel Russian aggression and to actually mount counteroffensive. What Ukraine has been saying since, the September of last year is that it needs more armored vehicles, it needs more heavy machinery to actually both protect its soldiers as Russians are shelling in a very heavy artillery exchange, and also to mount that counter defense. I mean, there's that famous interview of General Zaluzhny in The Economist, where he says that in order to build that pressure that Tom was describing, especially along the southern axis towards Melitopol, to choke Crimea and to basically underline Russia's supply lines through the fragile bridge that has already been damaged, it means Ukraine needs roughly 300 tanks in that direction. If you look at the numbers that the Western coalition was able to put together, and with long delays because of quite obstructive position by Germany that was slowing down a lot of other countries' eagerness to dispatch Leopard 2 tanks, we are talking about roughly 80 tanks. Will they make a huge difference? No, they will make some difference. And obviously, at this point of time, Russia is trying to recapture the strategic initiatives on the battlefield, which they have lost since the takeover of Kherson and collapse of the front line around Kharkiv. Russian army also suffered huge losses, and they are struggling to actually equip the new recruits that they are sending to the east. So more precise tanks, more durable, faster tanks could make a difference, but not a decisive one. And Ukraine needs much more suppliers, including all those other kit like aircraft to protect these very tanks that you mentioned.
Michael, if I could jump in here as well, as a former diplomat, worked a lot on these kind of announcements in past lives when I was a senior NATO official, that it's also important for listeners to remember that when we make announcements in major countries about new support or aid or assistance, the time from that announcement to the time when it's delivered, whether it's humanitarian aid, whether it's military aid, there's quite a gap. And so this challenge is, when these announcements are made, how fast can that actually happen? And that is kind of the clock that Ukraine is running against right now, particularly as the Russians really try to beef up in terms of the number of people they're throwing at this fight.
Very much so. Some of the reports I'm seeing here are suggesting that the German tanks or the Abrams won't arrive for 8 months, which is quite a while away. Tom, you've been covering this war for a long time, and I remember the sort of early days of the war where I was speaking with Ukrainian troops who be expected to be walking through Red Square by Christmas, and morale dipped a bit, and the Kharkiv offensive happened, and it was sky high again. What's the morale like at the moment, having just gone through a pretty cold winter?
So I think morale is, rather than say, as I said, I think we're past the stage of a euphoria now, simply because, as I said, the Ukrainian counteroffensives, despite the pretty significant progress that they made, do seem to have stalled. So, for instance, down south, if they want to press, any forward to, say, into the rest of Kherson Oblast, now that they've retaken the capital city, it's difficult because they've got the Dnipro River right in front of them. It's a very, very natural barrier that basically makes further troop advances very, very difficult. Now, I would say the Ukrainians aren't the same morale some senses that they've been the entire war. They are very, very ready to keep going. They are very, very willing, many of them, to sacrifice for their country. However, I do think that they are now realizing a situation that to make further progress on the battlefield is going to be very, very difficult without a significant uptick in Western support.
So, Daniel, being there on the front line, you have a really good idea on what's actually required on a battlefield. And it's really interesting when you go out to some front lines that it's things like shoes and boots that are often the things that people really, really need out there. What are the supplies that would make a real big difference, and what are the Ukrainian front lines a bit short of at the moment?
Well, they have been amazing. I have to say, the innovation that you see on the front lines in terms of how they're keeping themselves warm, not making makeshift cook stoves and heaters, and the kind of ways they're supporting themselves with food and so forth, that the military supply lines, they're doing a pretty good job on that. It's the civilian populations, again, here, which aren't part of that supply line structure, where I worry the most for the people that are still caught in the middle of all of this. You also have to remember it's not just food and clean water that we're talking about here, and heat. Not everybody in the country is healthy, right? And if you just look at our own countries, the number of people that maybe need insulin, maybe has asthmatic situations, maybe are diabetic, or many of these civilian populations, some of them are dealing with cancers or other long-term chronic illnesses. What I noticed when I was in Kharkiv and then went around to that area as we got closer to the front lines is the people that haven't moved west are the elderly and the disabled. Right? These are people in their 70s and 80s, and there's a significant number of them, and a lot of people with disabilities. And so that's a especially hard population to make sure you're supporting with the right kind of health supplies. We're providing mobile health clinics because most of the health clinics in these places have been destroyed or looted by occupying forces. And the challenge there is just getting enough support into these places and enough places to keep it going, as well as keeping the food going for the civilian populations.
Orysia, we had a bit of a chat about with earlier on with focusing on the tanks. But obviously the big story coming out at the moment is about the possibility of Ukraine getting F-16s. Do you think they are likely to receive the F-16s in the long run? And how much of an impact do you think they'll make?
So the key word is long run. In the long run, yes, I think Ukraine will receive, and we've seen it throughout this war. The list of kits that Ukraine at the beginning was told it's impossible, it's clear no, but then as Ukraine was demonstrating success with the limited kit even, and also as I think the transatlantic community understand the risk of Ukraine falling to Russia's occupation, and also what it actually means for the future of Black Sea trade, for overall the emboldenment of any aggressor around the world who will decide to deploy this kind of tactics and cover up itself with the nuclear blackmail. The more there is resolve to actually defeat as much as possible Ukrainian troops on Ukrainian territory. And here I emphasize, Ukraine is fighting on its own territory, and the West is supplying assistance to do exactly that job. Everybody knows the borders of Russia. They are clearly marked on the map. They cross the border into Ukraine, and they are committing war crimes. There are mass graves that Ukrainians are discovering. There are almost 60,000 cases of individual war crimes that are now recorded with the prosecutor general. All of that, which, signifies to almost a genocidal type of war, means that the West will be supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes, and it will take some time. That is why I think Ukraine is preparing groups of pilots who speak English, who are there ready to go for training. But let's not forget, there's still quite a lot of Soviet-era fighter jets, MiGs, that could be also sent to Ukraine from Eastern Europe, from Latin America, that could help in this battle. So it will come in stages. I think first Ukraine will use the kit it knows how to use, fighter jets, and then slowly prepare for more advanced aircraft.
Michael, can I jump in on this as well? When I was there, every time I talked to a government official, they would always say, what we need most is we need you to control the skies, a no-fly zone, protect us in the air. But I think it's also interesting to understand that this is not about just what's happening at the front lines, right? Why they were really saying that was not about the war at the borders at the edge in the east, but because of the way the Russians are executing this war, which is basically a war throughout the entire country, attacking the civilian populations and infrastructure. So their desire is, how do they defend this infrastructure and the civilian populations throughout their entire country, while Russian is the asymmetry here. Russian is just only fighting the war there at the border where the front lines are. And this is a big challenge. And of course, the fighter jets aren't as easily used against these drones and the rockets. And so it's a much more complicated thing in that where we were last February or March, where there were Russian fighter planes doing this stuff. Now it's these drones and rockets and other kinds of things coming in that's causing the damage throughout the rest of the country. And I think that's part of the challenge of this war. How do you change the asymmetry that's going on here, which is the civilian population is just getting beat down, and the whole country is at war for the Ukrainians trying to protect themselves, where the Russians are just trying to hold their ground on the Eastern Front.
I think that point is really well illustrated by the fact that going into winter, effectively Russia targeted the power and energy infrastructure very directly to try and force energy shortages throughout Ukraine. Tom, you're there in Kiev at the moment. Have they got power running, and how much of the country is electrified at the moment and living some sort of a normal life? Or is this affecting every single corner of Ukraine at the moment?
Well, it is affecting most of Ukraine. However, as with most things during the war, I mean, I have the luxury that I live, in the government district in the center of Kiev, where electricity shortages are fairly rare because it's a priority for power. However, while a lot of people were badly damaged by the fact that you couldn't get electricity for quite a while, the Ukrainians were able to repair a lot of the electricity infrastructure a lot quicker than I think a lot of people expected them to be able to. They also managed to work out fairly sensible rationing procedures for electricity. And so while it has been a difficult winter, I don't think there wasn't the sort of mass freezing to death all over the country that people were worried about. Now, the weather is only going to slowly get warmer from here on out. So I think in many ways, in terms of the humanitarian catastrophe that could have resulted, I did think we're past the worst of it, and I think the Ukrainians had sort of gotten themselves a way around to deal with this issue.
I agree with Tom there. The one thing I would say is it's kind of more of a slow bleed that we're starting to see now, that many of these people that last February were dealing with all the challenges of the displacement and everything else had a fair amount of savings, and they were using those savings. They've kind of used all that up. So a significant portion of the population has really stretched themselves over the last year, and now we're moving into the second year. And when this power does go out, and it does go out in a lot of parts of the country and a lot of the places, and it goes out temporarily, but when you drive around, you'll see the small businesses. The lights aren't on, so they're not open, right? They can't keep them open when there's no energy or lights. They can't run their businesses. People can't use the cash machines. People can't do all sorts of things, and we start forgetting about that. And what happens then is people aren't getting paid for the jobs that they want to be doing. So for the portion that's still employed, they're starting to have trouble with their jobs, and small businesses are struggling to stay alive. So you have this economic slow grind that Putin is well aware of, right? I mean, that's why he continues with this. It just kind of slowly pounds the infrastructure of the country. And while they're doing an excellent job of kind of restoring electricity temporarily till the next strike, the impact on that economy is really significant, and the impact on literally tens of millions of people is starting to show its wear.
Well, Daniel, following up on that question, obviously Zelensky is still talking about capturing all of Ukraine, including Crimea. Do you think that is, still, for a military standpoint or even a political standpoint, the first option on the table? Or do you think we may end up looking at a situation where something like a Transnistria, where frankly no one accepts with the situation, but we end up with a de facto border and a bit of a stalemate? What do you think is the most likely scenario for Kiev going forward?
Of course, having watched Russia do this now many times, that obviously is where analysts would kind of put the most likely scenario, that he would try to secure a certain set of territory and then hold it and keep it in a frozen conflict, and the Ukrainians would never accept it, but it would kind of get stuck there. But at the same time, this has been a surprising war, right? No one expected the Ukrainian resistance to be like it was. So I don't want to say anything about what's possible, particularly as the Russians also are really draining their capacity and capability, as you see them really stretch themselves and reach throughout the country for additional troops that are not trained, troops that don't have the right kind of weapons and stuff. So how this plays out, we'll have to see. And I think it's a lot, as our other speaker said, depends on what the West can do in terms of providing support and how fast that is. I do think, as a former diplomat, wars don't end often through victory. Sometimes, but rarely. Oftentimes it's diplomacy and peace agreements that get you to that point. And I think it would be good for everybody as a diplomat if the fighting stopped and everybody was able to take a breath. I know people worry about this, if it's just a short-term thing. I can understand why the Ukrainians won't want to do that. You don't want to just give them an extra couple weeks to reload. So I don't think we're there yet in terms of the Russians having acceded to the fact that this is not going to be a war they can win. And the Ukrainians equally. But at some point in time, you should likely expect that it has going to have to move to a ceasefire, and that people have some opportunity to see other ways out of what is a very violent conflict that's really affecting millions of people with deep trauma and humanitarian catastrophe.
Orysia, I'm going to throw that same question to you. Do you think military victory is still an option on the table, or complete military victory, or we are more likely to see some sort of grinding ceasefire at some point in the medium-term future?
I mean, I would like to reiterate that I think defeating Russia on Ukrainian territory is indispensable component of any kind of security in Europe. I think we have to keep in mind that this war has been going not just 1 year, it's been going for 8 years, and there was never ever any sustainable ceasefire, because what Putin is after, he is after Ukraine. He's also after pushing US presence out of Eastern Europe. We have seen Putin's ultimatum in December before he invaded Ukraine. And it's important to refresh in our memory what kind of regime we are dealing with. And I think, honestly, Russia has passed the point of return for negotiations. Obviously, Ukraine was negotiating with Putin with the mediation of Paris, Berlin, and at some point Brussels and United States for 8 years. Where did this lead us? It led us to war. So that is why I think Ukrainians are quite wise people. If you ask them, majority of them understand that territorial concessions, and if they make them, will not satisfy Putin's Russia, that they will have appetite for more. And interestingly enough, only 8% of Ukrainians believe that a peace deal with Russia will guarantee them security. They do not trust the current Russian leadership to respect Ukrainian sovereignty. So we may be here in the long run of a period where Russia knows that time is not playing in its favor, that sanctions are undermining its capacity to rearm, and they will have to do all kinds of trickery and using criminal networks to procure those much needed chips, and US will be after those networks. And Russia is not North Korea, that will turn all of its society into the armed forces. So this will eventually stall Russian system, whereas Ukraine, even with the horrible destruction and suffering that Daniel was describing, is hopeful. The main emotion in Ukraine now is that we will be a European country, member of the European Union and NATO, and we know why we are paying this price today. That is why I think it's hard to imagine this ending anytime soon in a negotiated settlement. There will be, I think, kind of operational pauses, regroupings, until Russian troops are defeated on Ukrainian ground.
So, Tom, I actually just wanted to quickly jump in to basically one of the points that I've heard made to me by quite a lot of Ukrainians is basically is a in some ways a reiteration of Orysia's point, is if you take a look at what happened with Crimea back in 2014, even back then Putin was saying, all we're trying to do is return Crimea to its rightful owners and there'll be no more, we're not going to take a part of Ukraine, any more parts of Ukraine, that's just propaganda, blah, blah, blah. And then you saw that 8 years later, after Ukraine had failed to really put up a fight for Crimea in 2014, Crimea was then used as a springboard for the invasion of large parts of southern Ukraine. And so if people in Ukraine are asked, well, why can't you just give up the Donbass or whatever? Well, their response is not just the fact that Donbass citizens are Ukrainian citizens and Ukraine wants to liberate them in that sense, but also if you give up Donbass, well, in another 8 years' time, Donbass will be used as a springboard for another attack on Kharkiv or Dnipro. And the sense that Ukrainians have is that if you give them an inch, that they will take a mile, and that they will just try and grind away at Ukraine. And even if it doesn't happen over a few years, it could happen over decades, until the Russians, after a lot of time and sweat and tears and blood, have taken large parts of Ukraine, much larger parts of Ukraine than they originally said that they wanted.
I fully agree.
Michael, can I jump in on that as well? Because I started this in some sense, which is one of the things. I just was up on the halls of Congress talking to some of the staffers up there recently, and they were asking me a lot of these questions. And the point that I made to them is, when they were asking, how does this end, is that the important point is that we follow the Ukrainians, right, and the Ukrainian leadership on this. The worst thing is for Western leaders to decide when enough is enough and when there should be some sort of ceasefire or when there should be some sort of negotiated settlement. That's not acceptable, and it's never turned out well in history when outside powers do that. So for me, this is a question for the Ukrainians. Of course, I work in the humanitarian space, so I really see up close the devastation on people's lives, the lost fathers, daughters, sons, children in this war. And so the sooner that violence ends, the better. But this really is a question for the Ukrainians, and I hope all of us outside of Ukraine remember that.
Tom,
and sorry, Michael, for jumping in. And I think Daniel is what we use a lot in this conversation is the word violence. And what happens through decades and centuries, actually, of Russian imperial project and Soviet project, that Ukraine was the object of immense violence, from extermination of, all the elites to Holodomor famine in the 30s. That was an intentional project to undermine Ukrainian peasant identity of independence. And you see, this also informs Ukrainians' choices today, because these memories are alive of grandfathers and grandfathers being sent to gulags because they would wave a blue and yellow flag. So this goes much deeper than just a conflict in modern time.
So, Tom, right now there's been massive reshuffles in both Ukrainian military command as well as the Russian military command. In fact, huge doctrinal shifts and effectively the death of the battalion level command structure that Russians been using for quite a while now. Is this a worry to the Ukrainians at the moment that there are these massive reshuffles and that Russia is going to throw a completely different hand when it comes to the next offensive? Or, frankly, are they just, reshuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic at the moment?
So this almost kind of takes us back to what people used to do in the Soviet Union when they would analyze, who was up or down in the Kremlin based by who was sitting where in a particular photo. What it does suggest is that Putin and this top political leadership in Moscow aren't particularly happy with how their various commanders have performed. So actually, strangely enough, there was a sense, I think, among some in the West that Surovikin, when he was appointed, no matter how ruthless he was at least a competent commander. I think when he retrenched from Kherson, for instance, I think he was able to do that and withdraw from the city only because he promised that there would be further advances in the Donbass to come. and he wasn't able to deliver those. So they brought back Gerasimov, who was one of the commanders at the very, very start. He was apparently the guy who came up with the idea for the lightning attack on Kiev and the attack on Hostomel, which does suggest that they may be planning something riskier and more flashy. And also Surovikin's, as we mentioned, it was his idea to start the mass strikes on electricity infrastructure, but that didn't cause the collapse of either Ukrainian logistics or the breakdown of morale in the civilian population. Now, I should make clear that the Ukrainian reshuffling has been actually less to do with the military command and more to do with the civilian leadership, which suggests that Zelensky and his political circles are reasonably satisfied with how their military are performing. You know, you keep generals if you like what they've been doing, and you swap them out in the case of Russia if you think they've been failing. So I think it's important to make that distinction clear.
Daniel, obviously politics is your field of expertise. You know, how is this going to change the European landscape politically going forward? You know, are we going to see the countries like Belarus at times or Hungary, who have been kind of a bit in the Russian camp and a bit in the EU camp, is that, keeping both feet in two camps now gone, and it's going to be a bit of a line down the middle of who goes where? Or if Ukraine does calm down, do you think we will see some of these countries return to trying to have their cake from both sides?
Oh, I think absolutely they will try to have their cake from both sides. Russia is a big, important power in the world and has a huge country with a huge amount of natural resources. So anybody who lives nearby that doesn't have its own significant economic engine will be interested in trying to support that. Most of all, of course, Belarus, which is mostly dependent on Russia, but Hungary as well, and some other countries also because of their attitudes. I think the challenge that we're going to face is less about those countries at the edge and more about the overall unity of the European Union and the Western allies in the face of this. It's amazing in today's world where it's hard to keep in the headlines, as you guys know, that Ukraine has been able to be a frontline story. The only reason that is, though, is because Putin has and the Russians have so brutally executed this war that you just can't look away when they keep committing these atrocities against civilian populations, right? So that's why it's not like it was when the war started in the Donbass. So if they continue doing that, we have unity. But if the Russians ever get smart and stop attacking Ukrainian infrastructure throughout the rest of the country, stop targeting apartment buildings and schools and hospitals and things like that, you have a different dynamic. And at that point, if it doesn't stay in the media, that's when I get worried about the politics, because all of our countries are struggling with all sorts of other challenges, polarization in our countries, COVID, economic weakness. And when that happens in political elections, attention starts turning inward, right? And you need a lot of Western unity for this sport to continue. The size of these appropriation bills in the United States are humongous, right? And Western support from Europe particularly is needed on the economic side, that bill is only going to grow. And as the world economy perhaps weakens in some places, will Europe be able to continue to provide very large checks to Ukraine to support what's needed there? I'm hopeful. I think Orysia is right. This is a strategically important place in the world right now, the center of protecting freedom and democracy and the principles that Ukraine is standing for, the principles that all our countries are standing for and need to be protected in this period of where democracy is under threat. But the challenge will be, how do you keep people's focus on that, and how do you keep paying what are some really large bills?
Orysia, that brings me really nicely to my next question. There's a lot of people who've studied history will point to the fact that we threw bucket loads of money at Afghanistan to fight Russia, and we threw billions at them. And then, as the moment the Russians left, we just stopped funding Afghanistan. We didn't build any schools. We didn't give them any attention once the Russians left. Do you think Europe will repeat that same mistake, or Ukraine is now a member of the European community and they will fund the rebuilding and the restructuring afterwards, and that we won't make that mistake once again?
Well, first of all, I think it's a mistake to compare Ukraine and Afghanistan. Afghanistan was a failed state. Putin attacked Ukraine at the time when Ukraine was one of the strongest in its state reform and building project. Ukraine has implemented an array of reforms that are impressive even for many developed European countries. Digitalization, for example, decentralization, where communities take hold of local income and do regional development projects. Ukraine is a vibrant democracy, as we have seen Zelensky ascend to power, being voted in free and democratic elections. So I think we have to come back to a purpose of this mission, why it is actually worth aiding Ukraine, and it is an investment into future of European security. It's not a charitable project to save poor Ukrainians from Russian ballistic missiles. Although, of course, for some people this would move their hearts and they would do it. But in a realpolitik way, if Russia gets an upper hand on Ukraine, we all will be worse off because, as I said, it will embolden further autocracies from China to Iran, and we definitely don't want that to happen. So I do think that Ukraine itself started thinking about how to rebuild and recover. It has a lot of ownership on ideas about future industries, including rare earth metals, IT, agriculture, machine building. Ukraine has quite strong human capital, although it, of course, will have to replenish and rebuild it. And Europeans know it. Today we have high-level delegation with Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the Commission, and all her commissioners in Kiev discussing the future, how Ukraine becomes a member of European Union. And that is a very strong signal for investors. Ukraine will be part of the European market, and it will be a game changer for economic revival. I think everybody will have a stake, including US industries, for renewables, but also for liquefied gas, for technology, and also especially military-related drone technology. Ukraine is now an amazing laboratory of testing of new technologies. So there will be a lot of interest. And I think there is, despite all the suffering and horror, a silver lining to it. What kind of Europe can emerge, including the future of Russia?
So we're going to wrap this panel up with a quick 90-second run around for each of our guests tonight. Where do you think the next 3 months in Ukraine is going to go? What do you think spring will bring for Ukraine? Tom, I'm going to start with you. 90 seconds. What are we about to see coming up?
So I'm going to try and be optimistic and say that if at any point in the war so far you'd bet against the Ukrainians, you would have lost quite a lot of money. And as I was mentioning beforehand, it seems that the Ukrainians are more solidly behind their military. They're more sure of their armed forces. And not only that, they have a good deal of intelligence and reconnaissance support from NATO partners, especially the United States. So I am hoping that we will be able to see a Ukrainian breakthrough in one of the aforementioned areas. And the Russia, the best prediction of future performance is past performance. And so it is hopefully going to be that the Russian mobilization really doesn't come to very much. Hopefully that isn't just wishful thinking.
Daniel, same question. What do you think is coming up over the next 3 months?
Well, I think there's going to be a significant increase in the humanitarian and economic needs of the country. That we're focusing mostly on military right now, but there's going to have to be additional attention on economic support, and it's going to have to be significant because we're going to see the weakening economy. The challenges, they won't be able to plant as much, and the harvest this year are going to be much worse as we move into this summer months. And so there's going to be a lot of investment that needs to happen in the next 3 months to position the kind of humanitarian support and the inputs that need to take place for Ukraine to keep growing its own food and feeding its people.
Orysia, what do you think is coming up the next 3 months in Ukraine?
I'd like to just reiterate what Daniel said. I think it's very important that support goes to Ukraine's economic home front, to keep companies, especially small and medium enterprises, going so people have jobs, they're able to lead as decent life as possible. To be honest, Ukrainian armed forces are paying relatively well, so there is some money in the economy going from that, from the soldiers now being able to spend more on buying better cell phones for their families. Just a little anecdote. But, on top of that, we will see another spike in military activity. Obviously, the two sides are preparing for another battle. I personally don't see how Russia can win, even if it gains some territorial ground. I think Ukrainians are, building a military of the future, while Russia has the military of the past, and they are getting more of the old junk from their garages, on the battlefield. But I think the Putin bets exactly on undermining this Western resolve to support Ukraine militarily. And he will do everything through all kinds of channels, media, disinformation, active measures to convince that, this is a basket case that Ukraine cannot win on the battlefield against Russia. We should be taking this with a grain, with a big skepticism, and actually communicating the opposite, that we understand the price why we are paying. And the sooner Russia understands that this doctrine of invasion is doomed, the sooner we will have peace. But we are not there yet, and definitely Putin is not there yet.
So I want to give a massive thanks to our three guests who joined us tonight. Daniel Speckhard, who is the president and CEO of Chorus International and former ambassador to Belarus and Greece. Orysia Lutsevych, who's the head of Chatham House's Ukraine Forum. And Tom Mutch, who's a Frontline correspondent who's currently in Kiev, who writes for everyone from the Daily Beast to the Time to everyone. He's just a fantastic guy, and I've known him for many years now. I also want to thank our audience for listening in. This will be available on Twitter for the next 7 days. And then after that, actually from tomorrow, it'll be available on YouTube as well. So thank you so much for tuning into another Redline Twitter Space. It's been an absolute pleasure being here, and I apologize for my flu-riddled voice tonight. But it's been an absolute pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next one.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.
It was a pleasure.